kingdom polemics exist to equip the church for battle against the kingdom of darkness in light of the particular threats of our day. Kingdom polemics is about taking the cosmic, Christological concepts of the Scottish Reformed and connecting it to the ground. Welcome to Kingdom Polemics. We are having a similar conversation that we've had multiple times, but there's some guests. You know Benjamin. He's been here once or twice to talk about the Westminster Standards has adjusted. Zach has been on here a few times to talk about women voting and stuff like that, you know? No, he wasn't on there. But we have a new person, the man of controversy, Mr. Stephen Wolf, who's joining us to discuss the various ways that people in the radical two kingdom universe tend to respond to classic two kingdom theology, or you could say public theology, various elements of how we understand a Christian nation. We want to interact with how they respond and the typical things that they throw out there as some kind of like a wrench to unhinge the conversation. But before we jump into just dissecting some of the responses that they do, it'd be good. I mean, yeah, you guys are known, but go ahead and like make yourself known. Give us your abbreviated bio.
I'll go first. My name's Benjamin Glasser. I'm pastor at Bethany ARP outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, down in the free state of South Carolina. And I'm been doing a lot of research in the early seceders in the colonies before it became the United States and their interactions with the early Presbyterian church that has, I think, a lot to say to the current controversy.
Yeah, man. You know your history, man. You argue really, really profoundly from the tradition. And you're from West Virginia, right?
That's right.
All right.
Born and raised.
Does the Carolinas feel like it's more like suburban, or is it?
Well, especially where I am, because Charlotte's the blob of Charlotte is moving this direction. We're still rural where I am, but we won't be for very much longer.
Yeah, Charlotte. That's like the woke place in the South, right?
The number of those places are
Yeah.
getting bigger.
Yeah,
that's probably a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. And Zach, you pastor in New Mexico, right? Albuquerque?
Yeah. No. New Mexico, yes. White Rock, New Mexico. It's near Los Alamos. So the nuclear lab. That's basically why we exist.
Well, like where people do experiments and stuff and blow up stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, it's Manhattan Project started here, and so goes back. History goes back to the 1940s, and it's a PCA church here. Been here since 1975. So there's a lot of history there I won't get into, but
you got a new book coming out, right?
Yes, that's correct. New Christendom Press. It's Honor Thy Fathers, Recovering the Anti-Feminist Theology of the Reformers. So it's probably half historical, looks at just kind of surveys 16th and 17th century Reformed theologians on male rule in the home church commonwealth. And then the second half, I contrast that with modern American Reformed practices and views. And so, I think it's should be interesting. Hopefully people like it. But
do you think it's going to be more spicy to people than the masculine Christianity, or equal or less?
Maybe more, because chapter 5 has a lot of critique of Tim Keller and the PCA 2017 report on women in ministry, which I'm not a big fan of. So probably because of some of that, it might get some traction.
Okay.
I think the environment's changed too. So I think that now, like when masculine Christianity came out, I think it came out in a way too early, if you know what I mean. Like I think now there's this like this larger market for those kind of books. So I think it's going to be big.
Yeah. The patriarchy thing and the masculinity thing, it's definitely on the front line of a lot of conversations. And Stephen, I guess you can tell us, I guess, what you can tell us about yourself. I know you're a man of mystery, so
yeah, I try to maintain that facade a little bit, being a mysterious world traveler and all that. Yes, I live in Central North Carolina. 4 kids, animals, have a bunch of acres and woodland and all that. So live out in the woods, write, do a little bit of teaching on the side, other random things too, other very mysterious things. But that's the Case Christian Nationalism book came out about a year and a half ago. So that's basically me.
all right. So one of the first things that oftentimes comes up with all NAPART guys here. We know that all NAPART guys here, which is always a good thing. Well, it can be a good thing. It should be a good thing, but sometimes it can be a bit confusing. But we're going to talk about that. So one of the things that oftentimes comes up in the talking about a Christian nation, establishment principle, classic 2K is this, and this came up a few times in the conversation with DG and others. It says when you guys begin to talk about these things, about any concept of a Christian nation, you're contradicting the story of the early church. We have nothing in the New Testament where we see that Paul and the apostles are in any way seeking to set up some kind of Christendom. And so therefore, since Christendom is not a part of the piety, missiology, and ministry of the apostolic church in the first century, you guys are pretty much departing from apostolic Christianity. That comes up a lot, and we have 3 very capable people to answer that. So what do you guys, when you guys hear that, like, how do you respond and process that particular objection?
Well, like most arguments from silence, they are about worth, whatever you want to put to them. But you could say the same thing about infant baptism and about women taking the Lord's Supper. There's no direct command to do either per se in the New Testament. You build both of those things off of the witness, not only of the continuation of some of the old covenant principles, but the nature of the expansion of the new covenant. And so when you begin saying that, well, Paul doesn't tell us to do this, or Jesus doesn't tell us to do this, or James doesn't tell us to do this, you're fundamentally making a Marcionite argument about the division between the Old and New Testaments. In fact, you're almost just sounding like a Baptist in regards to their argument in the divisions between the covenants in regards to baptism particularly. So that's kind of where you have to begin. You have to ask the question, well, what relation does the Old and New Testaments have with each other, and how historically has the Reformed understood the relationship between the Old and New Covenant?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the divines many times make that argument. They're like, the New Testament does not have to be very excessively speaking about Christendom in the way that it was in the Old Testament, because it's already been excessively treated very often. And so the New Testament is addressing specific things, right, in the New Covenant era. And so the continuity of the covenant of grace affects the way we would see the New Testament. Any other things about that point? I think there's more that we could say about it. That's a good point, though.
I've got one thought is, the New Testament also doesn't speak, directly to educational institutions, colleges, universities, seminaries, and yet I think we develop those things from the theology of Scripture, Old and New Testament, and even ironically, a lot of the guys criticizing the idea of a Christian nation teach at Christian seminaries, for training ministers and the like. You're not going to find those in the New Testament. So it's just there's a lot of things that there's just been development, of thought in applying to the modern world from scripture and natural law. So I just think, yeah, it's just not a very compelling argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see these guys like D.G. Hart says it, Scott Clark says these kind of things. They're just, when it comes down to it, they're just, I mean, I took this from Doug Wilson, but I mean, they're not even like American version, old style, like American Presbyterianism. They're just modern evangelicals. I mean, that's what they are. They take a modern evangelical approach, post-war secularism, and essentially baptize it. I mean, people say we want to baptize nations into Christian, and they're essentially taking the post-war liberal secularism or secular liberalism, and they say, well, that's the timeless politics of Jesus, and which is very surprising. I mean, how lucky are we that we live in an era that just happens to have the timeless politics of Jesus? But so I think yeah. But another point is like the within the Reformed system. I mean, grace assumes nature. The gospel assumes nature, which means that the universal timeless truths of the Old Testament and of nature are carried over and assumed into the New. So nothing has to be expressly commanded in the New Testament for it to be binding upon a Christian. And so the argument doesn't, to say where is it in the New Testament is actually to assume, is to rely on a theology that you probably should reject as a good Presbyterian or Reformed or just a good Protestant, I think. And the other thing too is that, I mean, in the early church and also among the apostles, they I mean, this is kind of my, I guess, twofold kingdom view coming out, but they were the heralds of the kingdom of Christ, the heavenly kingdom, they were heralds of salvation and grace unto eternal life. So if that was their main focus, that's why they were commissioned. That's why they were apostles. That's why people today are pastors principally. And so for them, it would actually be weird theologically, for my view, to start seeing the apostles talk about, oh, you must now charge and take the nations and make them Christian institutions and law, when really they came here as heralds of a different kingdom, of the kingdom of grace. And so that they're kind of assuming, the critique is assuming a kind of Kuyperianism, a post-mill Kuyperianism critique, which actually doesn't land upon at least me. I don't know if you other guys, I think if you're on my side or not on that, but so it doesn't actually land. And so the argument for Christian nations doesn't have to be because it came out of the mouth of an apostle. It could speak to what's the nature of government according to its institution, its design, its nature. There's all sorts of reasons, and that's why one reason why I approached my book the way I did was I thought there were good compelling reasons from reason and experience to affirm, Christian nation institutions.
Well,
so I just don't think all that works. I think, and one more thing, if I can, I also think that the gospel is mainly about eternal life. So I don't think this is another my view. I don't think that the purpose of the gospel is to then commission us to then kind of bring the kingdom down to earth and in temporal institutions, to conflate eternal and temporal. And so it would make the most sense that the people who are commissioned by Christ to kind of herald this kingdom would not be the ones saying, well, now that you're Christian, now you got to go storm take over, force Caesar to become a Christian or whatever, something like that.
Right.
It would make sense. It would be surprising otherwise. That's my point.
Yeah.
And I think biblically, you see that in Jesus's own ministry. You have two instances in his earthly ministry, one in Luke 12 and one in John 8, where he is asked to do the work of the civil magistrate. In Luke 12, he's asked by those men to discern the inheritance. And Jesus says, hey, that's not my job. I'm not the civil magistrate. He says the same thing in John 8 with the woman caught in adultery. It's not his job to put, the adulterers to death. In fact, John Calvin in his commentary on John 8 makes that clear that, that Jesus as a citizen, has no, I can't speak English well, no judicial role in the earthly kingdom. He is a herald, right? He is an eternal figure in that sense.
Yeah.
Right? let Caesar take care of what Caesar is supposed to do. He's supposed to put adulterers to death. He's supposed to discern inheritance laws. So Jesus there is assuming the continuity of the division between the civil and Christian realm, or the religious realm, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you see in the Old Testament, right? With the divisions between the separation of church and state that exists in the Old Testament, Jesus is assuming is continuing into the New Testament.
Yeah. One of the things I find interesting about this group of people, we're going to answer the same thing slightly differently. And so I'm tracking with what you guys are saying, but I would just add that the New Testament is stepping into the world of Afghanistan, where Christianity has yet not permeated the globe. I mean, most of the globe is it's been totally given over to Satan and paganism. So we can't expect things in ground zero going into the totally given over to Satan. And now he's bound, right? We're in the millennium. He's bound, and the gospel is going forth. So I wouldn't expect to see things in the first century that would be representative of the gospel in the world for centuries, number one. Number two, all the seeds of Christendom are planted by Paul. I mean, the book of Acts is written to a person in political power. The book of Acts targets people in political power. I mean, the first person we see is a person that is a part of the Ethiopian court, that is going to go back to Ethiopia and all the prophecies about, Ethiopia and those countries in North Africa covenanting with Yahweh. Then you have the centurion who has all these soldiers under him. And then you have a procurator in one of Paul's missionary journeys who has political power. And then you have Paul crash on an island where he encounters Publius, who is the first man of the island. And then the last part of his ministry, he's talking to all these people in political power. So why, if the New Testament is not interested in magistrates ruling and governing according to the lordship of Christ, right, in their temporal sphere, then why is there this regular targeting of them in the book of Acts? And so I think that the Christendom is, the seeds of Christendom are implanted in the New Testament ministry of the apostles and who they evangelize. And then you see the fruits of it, centuries later. So the Apostle Paul did not Christianize Rome, because that wasn't his mission, right? But in the Apostle Paul's ministry, you do see, as time goes on, the Christianization of Rome. So I don't think that. Go ahead.
Although, if I could add there, 1 Timothy 2, Paul says, pray for all people, including kings and those in high places. So he's specifically speaking of government officials. And part of that is, for God desires all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so it's the idea that God wants kings to come to a knowledge of the truth. Now, Paul doesn't lay out, political theory there. Well, how are they then going to govern? But the fact is, we want, civil officials to be Christians. And surely that change in mind and knowledge of the truth is going to affect how they govern. And then the question is how.
Yeah. And there's another thought in this whole conversation of objections. So one of the things that oftentimes comes up in the line of this is, like, we're not Israel. So we're talking about a Christian nation and Christian nationalism, and the statement comes up often, you're not Israel. And I'm like, yes, we're not Israel, and it doesn't matter. That's not a denial of the concept of Christian nation. But how would you guys answer to the R2K, we are not Israel, therefore the discussion of a Christian nation is inappropriate because we're not Israelites in Canaan?
I mean, first of all, I think it's a mistake to call it R2K, because people think, first of all, that it refers to Reformed 2K, which it's not Reformed classically. Or they think it's radical 2K, but it's actually not radical at all. It's basically a device to conform and reconcile people to the current zeitgeist, the secularism. So it's actually very modern. So I call it M2K. So that's what I'll call it, modern 2K.
I thought you were going somewhere else.
No, it's modern.
I thought you were going to say it's not radical because it's just Anabaptist rebaptized for Americans. But
no, and it's not radical because in the end it just reconciles you to the current.
Yeah,
on that front, I mean, that's That's one of the reasons I always say that they don't believe in two kingdoms. They believe in one kingdom. They only believe in the redemptive kingdom. They don't believe that the civil sphere has any kingdom responsibilities or has any relation really to what we are called to do as believers in the public sphere, especially. And that gets to one of the criticisms that comes up, is that they are so stuck in the mindset that the options especially in American, because everything has to be about America, evidently, but they're so stuck in this American mindset that the two options are spirituality of the church or Rushdoony. Yeah, that what we are saying, and that what Christian nationalism is just the next generation of Chalcedon, of Doug Wilson, of whomever you want to frame in that kind of Kuyperian world. Whereas classical two kingdoms doesn't just predate all that, but it's really asking and doing different things than what Rushdoony or Bonson or North or Damar or any of those guys were doing. Now, I think we can learn stuff from those guys. I'm not, discounting them, but it's a totally different mindset, and they, Hart and Clark especially, cannot think out of the side of the categories that they kind of grew up in. It's one of those things where they're almost like frogs in the pot. They just that's what they dealt with as young men, was Rushdoony, North, and that's what they think's still going on, which is part of why their reaction is the way it is. They just think we're all Christian Reconstructionists and theonomists, when that's just not true.
It goes back to Meredith Kline, and he was an overreaction on the other side to theonomy, and rather than what I think is the correct view of the Westminster Standards, the general equity, which is rooted in the moral law, to guide the civil government, and so they read everything as theonomy, Bonson and the like. So that's how I see everything. So you can go read Klein and Van Drunen and those guys. They rooted in the Noahic covenant. I think they're wrong and they divide it wrongly. But this goes. Itself, but
yeah, I think this is evident in Van Drunen's latest book. I think it is a Politics After Christendom. I think it is, where you read it and he's addressing his old opponents, which are the theonomists, the Kuyperians, Neo-Calvinists, and one of the people early on, like some of the people who questioned Van Drunen but also claimed two kingdoms, was people like Brad Littlejohn and some others. And Brad he's written several things on it. And in Van Drunen's book, Brad literally got, I don't think he even mentioned him by name. No, he did. He did mention, I think, his book. That was his dissertation. But he literally got a footnote. So all the work of the last 10, 15 years of people saying, wait, there is this more classical, coherent version of two kingdom theology that is, you can see in Richard Hooker and Calvin and other people, it got a footnote, and which speaks to the point that these guys are fighting these other enemies. And a lot of their objections, if they do land at all, they're landing on a camp that is not ours exactly. I certainly would work with Doug Wilson, of course, but if you're attacking post-mill, you're not attacking me ordinarily. So, or Kuyperianism probably is a better example. If you're attacking Kuyperianism, then you're probably not going to attacking.
Well, one thing, that's the thing that part of the issue is that they collapse all these conversations about Christianity in public or civil or national. They collapse them into one soup, and it actually confuses people a lot. But one thing I think about often when people say we're not Israel, I think about the Westminster Standards and how it says that the law of God the Ten Commandments does not begin in Sinai, right? The Ten Commandments begins in creation. That's Westminster 19:1-3. And then it says 19:2 that this law after the fall continues to be a perfect rule of righteousness. And then it's delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in the Ten Commandments. So if we're talking about the Ten Commandments, which is basically first table and second table, that is not something that is particular to Israel. It never was particular to Israel. It's given to his creation. And it's administered to Israel, but then there is particularities of the Ten Commandments that are things that are particular to Israel. But the Ten Commandments, meaning like a concept of Sabbath, right? And a concept of blasphemy that is to be enforceable. And the second table, those things are not Israel specific. And that's why God held all nations accountable to these things, even though they weren't Israel. And hence the idea that some kind of concept of first table and second table of the law of God in Scripture is exclusive to Israel. It goes against our standards, which bring the law of God first and second table as to be a creational issue, right? Or as Stephen would say, a nature issue that Israel is brought into, but it's not particular to Israel. So we're not Israel. That's not an argument against. Nebuchadnezzar was not in Israel, but he was punished for blasphemy, right? Herod in Acts chapter 12 was not, in geopolitical Israel per se, and he is also dealt with by God for public blasphemy. So we're not Israel. Yes, we're not, but it doesn't negate the fact that the Ten Commandments, first and second table, are measures and standards for all nations and all societies. The particular expression of those and application of those would vary, right? And I think that's where you and your book, Stephen, bring that a lot. So that's not an argument against we're not Israel, right? Sodom and Gomorrah was not Israel. And yet they were held accountable for public and egregious sodomy. But a good thing to bring up is the spirituality of the church, right? So a lot of times when we're discussing these things and we're talking about Christian and nation or public religion or however you frame it, they bring up the spirituality of the church and they'll start talking about, men like Hodge and others. And so the idea is that the spirituality of the church it's not conducive to a discussion of public religion or national religion of any sort. So that's something that, and you guys brought up earlier how actually the R2K guys and the spirituality church guys have actually teamed up, which they weren't previously connected, but now they are. So let's talk about that a bit. Let's talk about how the spirituality church is oftentimes used as an argument against us speaking of Christianity in a national sense.
Let's maybe start with explaining the spirituality of the church. So it actually goes back to Scotland, and it's picked up probably it's most known for the Southern Presbyterians adopting it, though Hodge himself adopts it. And there's differences between Hodge and some of the Southern Presbyterians like Thornwell or Stuart Robinson, who Hodge considered them to be more radical on this question. But basically, their point is that the church is a spiritual entity and therefore should not get involved in politics, political questions. So like Hodge, for example, opposed the Spring Resolution 1861 when the Civil War began, which called for the allegiance to the federal government, and the southern states had seceded, and so their allegiance was to their states. Well, okay, so that's a political question. Who do you owe your allegiance to? And so Hodge said you can't decide that. That's not the church's business to do that. So that's just an example. I think Hodge was right there. Most people would probably agree with him. But this doesn't really decide a lot of the issues here related to two kingdoms and Christian nationalism and the like. So I just want to give a brief explanation of that. Although I would note Stuart Robinson is actually probably the closest guy to, like, Van Drunen draws on him some in his Natural Law in the Two Kingdoms book. And I mean, that's a whole topic, and so we could discuss him some. But even those guys weren't holding these positions because they wanted a civil government to not establish religion, but they still were big on like Sabbath laws and things like that. So there's some differences here for sure. But
Yeah.
And I believe Hodge was Charles Hodge was pro the amendment, right? The Christian amendment,
Yes.
wasn't he?
Yeah.
You guys
him
know the
and
history
his
better than I
son.
do.
Yeah. AA. They both
Okay.
supported the amendment to the Constitution to declare Christ as I forget exactly how that's worded, but basically recognize Christ as head of all things.
Yeah, I think it was added to the preamble.
I didn't know that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I would say that, like, when we say church, we should be clear what we mean by church, because you can think of church as like the people of God, like the visible Catholic Church across the world, not under no one but Christ, or you could think of the institution, so the local the ministry of the church or regional church, whatever you guys believe, and then see. You have the that so when you speak of the spirituality of the church as an institution, that to me just says that their mission is not politics. They're not the hub. Sometimes I get the sense that the guys in Moscow see the ministers as like the sort of channel through which politics come. So they are the means through which politics is preached. You get your marching orders, you go to church, and you do politics. And so it's a very much of a top-down, heaven to earth sort of, and he's like the mediator of that the marching orders. Whereas and then if you for the argument, the spirituality of church argument would then work against that position, or theoretically. But if you take the position that, okay, it is spiritual, but then Christians still outside of the church as Christians, not necessarily under the pastor, but under Christ, under God as Christian human beings in the world, then they can conduct political activity to bring about Christian institutions and Christian civil order. So there's no contradiction. Like, I think you can affirm spirituality of the church in the sense of the ministry being ordered to those things, spiritual things.
Yeah.
At the same time, the people themselves exist as Christians in civil society under God to enact Christian civil order. I don't see any contradiction in that.
I agree. To clarify, I think with Hodge and the Southerners, spirituality of the church would speak more to what can general assemblies speak to, and what should pastors say from the pulpit. Because you go read those guys, though, I don't know, Dabney, Hodge, they're writing on everything, outside of that. So it's more of like a pulpit ministry, like church strictly as an institution question.
Yeah. Let me just summarize what you guys are saying. Spirituality of the church speaks about the eschatological mission of the church. It doesn't speak about the spirituality of the entire Christian life. So spirituality of the church is a doctrine about our ecclesiology and our missiology, but it doesn't make the Christian now be perpetually in this endless loophole of the spirituality of the church as an individual, And secondly, I find it intriguing that the spirituality of the church oftentimes is brought up to object to Christian nation conversations, when the men who the men who very much developed this doctrine and put it in confessions, they were all Christian nationalists. So the spirituality of the church doctrine comes from Christian nationalists who believe that they were national covenanters. Right? So I think it's kind of funny that when we talk about any concept of Christ and nation, the spirituality of the church objection is thrown up when the men who really developed that doctrine well and put it in their statements, they very much had a concept of a Christian nation. But the spirituality of the church does not secularize the state, right? So simply because the church has an eschatological mission, it doesn't mean that demands for a neutralization or secularization of other things, right? So simply because the church is the eschatological institution, it doesn't mean that families then are neutral or secular. There is no spirituality in them, right? There is no holy or sacred or unto God purposes. It just means that there's a specificness to the church, but the family and the civil sphere, it's not secularized necessarily by the eschatological. And that's the thing. What you brought up, Ben, I thought was interesting, because what you're saying is these guys are one kingdom guys in the sense of like they're the only kingdom that exists, functionally speaking, that is significant to Christ. Is the eschatological one, right? And so the temporal kingdom has no has no distinct Christian purpose because it's not eschatological, right? But Romans 13 calls deacons, it calls the magistrate a deacon, right? So yes, he's not eschatological, he's not bringing in the eschaton, but he has a purpose unto the Lord, right? That is, it's not
well,
neutral.
that gets into one of the questions, one of the distinctives, I guess, in this conversation is, for instance, if you look at the first chapter of the ARP's form of government, the first chapter of the ARP's form of government deals directly with the question of God's authority over the magistrate. In 1:1, it says, God the Father is the source of all power and authority. No authority, either civil or ecclesiastical, exists except that which God has established in his word. Civil authority is instituted by God the Father through civil offices. Now, as you hear that, right, that's in our form of government. That's the first thing our form of government says. And basically what I'll go with Stephen's term, the modern two kingdom guys are saying is that God the Father has no authority over the civil realm. The civil realm at best is providential, whereas traditional Reformed theology teaches that that the civil realm existed in the garden. Adam had a responsibility as the civil head of his family to protect Eve from the intruder into the house. In a sense, right, Adam failed to inhabit his responsibility as the civil head to prevent Eve from being tempted by Satan himself. And so again, like Stephen points this out in the book, but you can read just about anybody who wrote on these matters 200, 300, 400 years ago in the Reform world, and there's that understanding again that all things under heaven are under the authority of God the Father and must answer to God the Father. It's one of the reasons why we see the judgments we see towards the end in the book of Revelation, right? When Jesus comes on the white horse with King of Kings on his thigh, he's not just destroying Satan, but he's destroying all of the civil authorities that allied themselves with Antichrist and with the beast and tried to destroy the church of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, as you get into some of these distinctives, right, you have to keep that in mind. Right? That God is the Father, is the source of all power and authority, both civil and ecclesiastical.
Yeah, so our view of creation is very much connected to how our view of spirituality, right? So I don't know if you guys have read Junin, but he says at one point that the gospel is not creation regained, but it's new creation gained. So basically, God has a creational purpose, and the gospel doesn't restore creation, right? Or perfect nature, renew nature, however you want to say it. Like the new creation is some discontinuous other thing. And I think once you realize that God's creational purpose is not set aside, but the covenant of grace comes in to renew and restore God's original purposes, you see how the spirituality of the church is not unhinged from things like gender, marriage, family, right? So yeah, the spirituality of the church, when I hear the spirituality of the church articulated by these guys, what I hear is something that sounds more like Gnosticism than I think what men would have said historically about that doctrine. Is that fair to say, or am I saying too much?
Yeah, I find it just so bizarre that people will affirm these doctrines and then somehow think that it leads to modern secularism. It's like, oh yeah, it's always strange to me when I talk to someone and they're like, yeah, I believe, or he believes two kingdom theology. That's why they believe in secularism. And it's always like, what? Like, and then you ask them like, well, did Calvin and all these other guys P2K? They're like, oh, of course, Calvin. Yeah, they're all 2K. Like, okay, well then they were wildly inconsistent then and incoherent and blatantly. And you see that there might be a problem here. I mean, of course everyone errs, and of course all of them could have erred. They all could have somehow been blindingly, incoherent. But yeah, it's very strange to hear people like historical doctrines associated with historical people who also thought that you should have Christian public order. So
Yeah,
I find it very, very bizarre. It's almost like as if no one. It's easy because we can simply just point that out. Like that's such an obvious mistake in their thinking that if you just point out, well, okay, all those guys don't agree with you on politics. So like what's going on here? And then that I think is that the beginning of them clearing out all the nonsense that they've heard from some of the seminaries and other writers, to move them more towards, I think, the more historic view.
One of the things that they bring up oftentimes too is like this Christian nation conversation. It doesn't come from Scripture. It actually comes from Constantine. That's what actually what DG said in one of the conversations. So this is a Constantine thing, and post Constantine, all of a sudden now, because of Constantine and the politicization of, if that's even a word, of the church, that's what really leads to this Christendom. But it's not from the Scriptures. It's not from the early church. Do you think that's, obviously you don't, but I'm just going to ask a question. Is it fair to say that this concept of Christian nation and Christianity defining the terms and contours of public life, that is something that is attributed to Constantine, and it's not something that the reformers actually got from the Scriptures? Go ahead and go with that one, because that comes up a lot as well. Is the reformers' position coming from the Constantinian politicization?
Well, I mean, so my perspective is that if, like we said earlier, if that they're in a state where political power is utterly impossible, at the same time they have a mission to spread the kingdom of God, which is, I think, essentially preaching the gospel, establishing churches, conversion of hearts, and so they have that mission. And then I'm not an expert on early church, on the patristics, so I'll be honest. But as I understand, the political theology wasn't thoroughly developed by them. I could be wrong about that, I admit. But when the possibility arose, obviously with Constantine, now all of a sudden you have this need to, now how do we understand the political questions? And you see this throughout, like, we all affirm positions that have been developed over time that are not explicitly articulated by Irenaeus and these other guys in patristics. But we see that when these controversies and issues and circumstances arise, that there is a need to then articulate them coherently with the rest of doctrine. So it's not surprising that political theology became something that was developed over with Augustine and others through into Christendom, into the Middle Ages, into early modern period, because that there was a need, given circumstances, to put that together. The fact that there was a development doesn't in itself mean that it contradicts Scripture, it doesn't flow from principles of Scripture, and so the argument, I think, doesn't in itself work. It would have to be demonstrated that our actual claims are false, because it's perfectly coherent to say that circumstances would raise questions that then need to be answered, and that weren't asked before. That makes any sense.
Every area of theology has had development. Over the centuries. I mean, no seminary professor is going in and teaching a theological subject as if it's first century. It's just silly, frankly, to speak that way.
So the church doing something in the era of Constantine, right? You're saying this is a maturation of Christianity. It's not the novelty of infusing something that has not existed before. And I would say as well is that also on top of what you guys said, I've read enough of Calvin and even Luther and a lot of the divines, Gillespie and Rutherford and Bailey. They were not making arguments from Constantine. They were making arguments from nature. You see them cite, a lot of like the classics when they're making arguments. You see that very much in Rutherford's work, Lex Rex. But they also are making arguments from Deuteronomy, Exodus, Samuel. I mean, there's so much of the citations of the Book of Kings in Calvin's writings. So if someone claims that like they're reformers and the Puritans and the post, the generations after like the early Reformation, that they were just in this paradigm of Constantine, they haven't really read. how these men worked out their thought. And by the way, they had to work out a political theology because the political theology of their time was unbiblical, right? They have Erastianism and then they have the papacy. And so their arguments were exegetical, textual, and historical, and from nature. They weren't just, we're just in the matrix of Constantine and we're just not even thinking exegetically. As a matter of fact, I find their exegetical arguments very compelling when you see them walk through things. I'm going through Rutherford's book on disputation of liberty of conscience. I'm kind of probably like paraphrasing, and he's going through like the whole Bible to unpack that. He wasn't just parroting, Constantine. But another important thing I think to bring out and address is a lot of times when we talk about these things, the objection of the modern two kingdoms or radical two kingdoms or whatever you want to say, is that the American standards, okay, and the American Presbyterians are very much a compelling claim for why any conversation of Christianity in public or nations or whatever is inappropriate. So like, look at the American standards and look at their revisions and look at men who were American Presbyterians, like Hodge and Warfield. I mean, they brought up Machen like over and over again. Like, I don't know, like those guys are obsessed with Machen. I don't get the Machen obsession, but I understand.
It's because he's libertarian,
Okay.
Essentially, that's part of it.
Like it was a bit religious the way they were invoking nations. So yeah, but what about the American Presbyterian tradition and the standards and the adjustments as a case for the objection of what we're talking about? Like, how would you guys answer that?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I'm obviously in a denomination that doesn't hold to the American revisions. So,
hey, wait, but you guys have some changes.
Well, we have some changes, but we maintain the original confession in chapter 20 on liberty of conscience, and our chapter 23 is explicitly calling for Christian magistrates to rule according to Christian principles, and then we maintain the original in chapter 31 in regards to synods and councils. But we talked about this at length in when I was on last time. But even the American revisions still maintain that the civil magistrate has responsibilities to the moral law and its application in the civil realm. Especially, we've already mentioned the Sabbath testimony, but you go into the larger catechism especially, and there's multiple places where the American revisions are in contradiction to modern two kingdoms.
Yeah, go ahead. Aldo.
No, yeah, well, like the one is Westminster Larger Catechism 108 talks about disapproving, detesting, and opposing all false worship and removing monuments of idolatry in our places and callings. That's still in there. Anyway, what are you gonna say, Zach?
I was just gonna say the structure of the original Westminster standards is still there. They only kind of modified, some of the application. So for example, the larger catechism, the catechisms weren't changed at all, except for one thing. Is it 109, larger catechism
109 on tolerating false religion? Yeah.
Tolerating false religion. That's the only thing that was changed on the catechism. So let's note that. I mean, the larger catechism is quite extensive, and it's a big part of it is the moral law, the 10 Commandments, and all of that structure is still there. So I think that's important to note, and that includes that. So obviously they modified the one thing on the second commandment with tolerating false religion. Now I don't think that. I mean, this gets into the whole debate of can we still hold that? I think so. I think it's obviously consistent with the rest of the larger catechism. Mm-hmm. But they didn't change anything on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, I think it's larger catechism 118. Speaks of superiors. There's the duty of superiors to enforce the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Well, if you read through the larger catechism, superiors refers to anybody in authority, and that's with the fifth commandment, that would be the family, church, or commonwealth. So commonwealth superiors have a duty to enforce the Sabbath. That's how I read the larger catechism. I think that's still there. And I don't, I mean, we could also mention some things in the confession about maintain piety is in the, what is that, 23:2. The magistrate should especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace.
Yeah.
So there's plenty there that would, I think, favor some sort of Christian nation reading.
Well, hey, Zach, I got a question for you. So in the PCA, what are the in terms of taking exceptions to things like this? What are the presbyteries like? So, I mean, do they? It's kind of their choice, right? If they're going to force you to take an exception on something,
unless the General Assembly rules on something, then yeah, it's up to the presbyteries as to what they allow. I've known guys who have taken exceptions on this, saying, not in my presbytery, but in other presbyteries, where they say they hold the original standards on civil government, and it's been permitted at least by some. But I mean, there's other guys like that just, I mean, I don't see why you would need to take an exception on this.
Yeah,
because you're not contradicting, unless you're contradicting the standards. I mean, if they want to ask you about your views of civil government, and then they think that is like, if somebody thought I was espousing views contrary to our standards, then they could bring me up on charges. But I don't think we're espousing anything that's inconsistent with the American standards.
The American standards, it's reduced Christendom, but it's not R2K and secularism, right? I mean, it talks about religious protection of those of the Church of our common Lord. Even the section in it's interesting, the citation for the civil magistrate in 23. One of the citations of the civil magistrates in chapter 23 is Nehemiah beating up people for breaking the Sabbath. So that's one of their citations. And what's interesting as well is 129, Larger Catechism, talks about superiors, that they are to protect, provide all things necessary for soul and body. And so the Westminster Standards, and by, not just the standards themselves, but if you see how Presbyterians in their General Assemblies, the things that they would talk about, and the things they would say, I mean, Charles Hodge is oftentimes cited as being like this rabid R2K Escondido theologian, but I'm pretty sure, you can correct me, guys, he said that we could overthrow our government if they don't protect the Sabbath. That's not Drunin saying, if I were to go on another planet and establish a colony with Presbyterians, I wouldn't even enforce the Sabbath, and then invoking Charles Hodge and the American Presbyterians. So I do think the American Presbyterians were not as intense and would go as far as like the Scots and the English Puritans, but they definitely believed that Christianity was a national thing, and they saw Hodge saw his country as a Christian nation. So invoking, go ahead.
There are some differences here, notably Robert Louis Dabney, Thomas Ephraim Peck, and Stuart Robinson. They would all reject the idea of a Christian nation. Okay, so that's why those guys actually have the closest views to like Escondido modern two kingdom theology. However, the main area where they would be opposed to, nation naming Christ, Thornwell differed there. He wanted nation honor Christ in writing in the Constitution. But the other guys, so they wouldn't want to enforce, like blasphemy laws and things like that. But the noticeable difference, though, is they were all huge supporters of Sabbath laws. They all made statements like Hodge, where it's basically like Sabbath laws are essential to the nation, to the health of the nation, and if you don't have them, it's it's basically tyranny, and so I mean, I think that's essentially universal from what I've read. I've never seen an American Presbyterian, we'll say pre-1900, because I'm sure some things started to change in the 20th century. I've never seen anyone pre-1900 oppose Sabbath laws or say they wouldn't have them. So the Escondido thing with Van Drunen, not wanting Sabbath laws. I mean, it's totally contrary to Reformed theology and history. It has no basis whatsoever.
Yeah. So the West, isn't there like in one of the General Assemblies, wasn't there like an appeal to the government about the Sabbath?
Oh, well, there was the Sabbath males controversy,
Yeah.
as they called it in the plural. That goes back into the early 1800s. And actually, they lost. The federal government was delivering mail on Sundays. And the Presbyterians were sending petitions, as were as were other Christians. Let's be very clear. This was not specific to the Presbyterians. The Methodists, the Baptists, everybody was a Sabbatarian. Everybody wanted Sabbath laws. Yeah. All of this changed as of late. Okay, this is a modern, change from historic Christian doctrine. And so, they lost on the Sabbath male controversy, but of course now the federal government doesn't deliver on Sunday, so we're somehow in a better spot there, I guess. But
totally. Yeah, so the American standards are, and even the founding. You guys talked about the founding a lot, and I guess one of the things like these guys bring up is the American founding clearly makes a case for principled pluralism. And you and Klein went back and forth, and were saying Christianity was assumed. One of the things that, I mean, you guys might disagree with me, but the reason why postmillennialism is not obtusely in the standards is because everyone was postmillennial that wrote the standards. They were all post-mill. They were historicists post-mill, and so there's no like, we are post-mill, we must be post-mill. So there's no like, you can see it embedded in there, so you don't have to articulate it. But when it comes to like the American founding, and when you go there, and even you see the statements in chapter 23, there was an assumption that everybody was some kind of Christian, right? And so when they talk about toleration, I don't know, you guys correct me, I don't believe they're thinking about unbelieving Jews and Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists when they're talking about the protection of religious liberty, right? Isn't that one of the things I've heard many times said, right?
Well, I mean, even if you just take at face value what the American revision says in 23:3, it says, yet as nursing fathers, it's the duty of civil magistrates to protect the church of our common Lord without giving the preference to any denomination of Christians above the rest, in such a matter that all ecclesiastical persons, whatever, shall enjoy the full, free, and questioned liberty, if discharging every part of their sacred functions without violence or danger. And as Jesus Christ appointed regular government and discipline, continuing on, he says, among the voluntary members of any denomination of Christians, according to their own profession and belief. So there's
what about what about the infidel? There's something in there about infidels that was brought up a few times.
Well, pretense, and no person be suffered out of a pretense of religion or of infidelity, offering indignity, violence, abuse, or injury. Basically, it's saying you can't put people in jail for worshiping Satan. It doesn't say anything.
You can publicly. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it doesn't really say anything about countenancing those religions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because it goes on to say, to take order at the very end, that all religious and ecclesiastical assemblies be held without molestation or disturbance. But I think, even the language ecclesiastical, I think that's referring to churches. So I don't think it's saying you have to protect. Well, let's put it plainly. They were not trying to protect, satanic assemblies. Okay.
Wait a second. You know that when they wrote that, they had in mind the Satan statue in the Capitol, bro. You know they had in mind that.
Yeah, but in infidelity, I mean, I don't know, that could be referring to like Unitarians, because they were infidels, as far as rejecting
it
Christianity.
could be or
I mean, historically, you see a number of attempts or entreaties, if you will, from civil governments against the Mormons all throughout, all the way from Northeast Ohio, all the way into Nauvoo, even into Utah. There are specific injunctions made against the Mormons by the civil government that were held lawful. And, even Utah's inclusion in the states as a state required Utah to meet a particular, if you want to call it Christian, you can, Christian understanding of monogamous marriage. So even historically, the evidence is not towards a principled pluralism, because if it was, then polygamy would be legal in Utah.
I doubt the Presbyterians were protesting those actions by the government.
Yeah, I mean, another thing is at the time, the founders. I don't know about Witherspoon, the other guys who wrote this, but the founders had not experienced a lot of immigration. It was very homogenous in terms of culture and background. Most 80% plus were British, and there were some Germans. All those Germans, for the most part, were actually Protestant Germans. And even then, they were very much not liked. So among certain people, so Benjamin Franklin did not like Germans, and actually established an organization to try to anglicize them or whatever. Mm-hmm. So and could they have foreseen that there'd be this massive rush of Roman Catholic? I mean, this is the Sabbath issue, but because Roman Catholics were accused of kind of disrupting that norm, the Anglo-Protestant norm of Sabbath observance. Mm-hmm. And the Irish and the German Catholics show up, and then they start disrupting that law, and that's I think that's kind of maybe like there's ethnic components to that controversy, perhaps. So, but anyway, the point is the founders. I mean, to their experience, it was if there was immigration, it would principally be from Protestant England or Scotland or Protestant Ireland, and so it wouldn't be this idea of principled pluralism. Probably wasn't on, and even when there was, like, you have people like Alexander Hamilton, you have Madison, you have others. I have to look it up, but there's others main founders who commented on immigration and were very concerned about it, and they're principally talking about German Protestants. So,
because the Presbyterians,
it's a huge discussion there. But yeah, go ahead.
The Presbyterians at the time are dealing with. I mean, but just to be clear, they don't have a state church anywhere in the colonies or states. Mm-hmm. So they're always playing second. Did. Right. But so the Presbyterians are playing second fiddle, and they're trying to get basically, full inclusion and rights, because early on they had some trouble in some of the Anglican colonies and the like. So they're dealing with Congregationalists, Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, and then there's some heretics, Unitarianism's kind of on the scene, but that's pretty much it.
But even so, I think that, like, the statement in the chapter you guys are talking about is a duty of civil majesty to protect the person, good name of all their people. I think that's talking about the duty of the civil ruler to prevent some vigilante Anglican from slapping a Presbyterian, or a Congregationalist to punch the guts of a Baptist or whatever they're going to do, whip them. So basically, you're preventing religious vigilantism. Mm-hmm. That's what the main point of it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But you can still, if someone's a public blasphemer, you could still actually punish them, which of course is what they did, and there was laws like that forever. So I don't think that it just has to be under law. It can't be under religious vigilantism, which I think is what I think Witherspoon says the same thing in his lectures. He essentially says that you can't allow these rival denominations to duke it out in the streets, physically at least. And that's it. So that's why I think that this is completely consistent with having a robust Christian, not only Christian nation, but Christian state. It just
which they also had at the time, right? They had at the time. I mean, all the states still had state churches, or they were phasing out, but they had laws requiring civil officers to take oaths, religious oaths. So all that stuff's in the background here.
I think that people are so socially accustomed to a secularist interpretive frame that they think. I mean, I don't have these conversations with pastors too often, but they think that this is essentially calling for what we have now. But if you read it closely, I mean, if you just read it, it doesn't actually do that. And it permits, actually, what I like about it, given like my perspective, it does permit actually a wide, like it permits flexibility. So you can have a strong, robust, assertive Christian state, nation, But also, if you have one that's diverse, you can deal with the diversity of it without kind of undermining and destroying the Commonwealth, destroying the Commonwealth. And if you're a Christian minority, it kind of also provides that sense of your relation to the civil magistrate and all that. So I think it provides the flexibility that perhaps the original one didn't. I don't have any problem with the original one, but anyway, I think it is a very American document, but at the same time, it's not secularist or demands neutrality.
See, that's the thing. Like people give you a hard time. You're nicer than me, man. You know, like if I was able to advise for the new Christian nation, I'd be like, Pentecostalism is not allowed to be publicly practiced at all. You know, Arminian practices are not acceptable. You can be Arminian in your house. You know. So I'm not, you're a nice guy. I don't know why people give you such a hard time, man. And also non-Reformed Baptists, no, you guys gotta do Bible studies in your house too. You gotta be like a 69 or something. So, but either way, like that's the conversation, right? Like, what kind of a Christian nation are we arguing for? But the arguing against any concept of a Christian nation at all, because it's inconsistent with like the spirituality of the church or the Westminster Standards or the American founding. Like, it's just it's not fair. But one thing I actually saw you say this on the internet, I think yesterday or today. So you were this is Stephen. You said the civil realm is not supposed to perfect nature, but only restrain it. So therefore, we cannot speak about it religiously or in a Christian sense. So because the civil realm is not to perfect nature, restrain it only, therefore this conversation we're having is assuming that we believe that the civil realm has the power to spiritually correct and mature people. And you actually had a good answer for that. Why don't you comment on that some? That'd be good.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is a tweet I did. I was opposing basically the modern two kingdom perspective. Is they want to juxtapose the state having a role, their role being what's the word? Restraining sin. That's not the word. I can't remember what the word is now. Preserving. It has a preservative role. It preserves. It's a post hoc, post fall sort of institution, and it's meant simply to act upon society to restrain sin and preserve it so it doesn't collapse. That's the idea of civil government. And then they would juxtapose that with the we call the perfective view, or the idea the state can have a positive, not just confront sin, but also promote the good directly. Like Aquinas and others would say, the role of civil government is to make men good. So there's that would be the more perfective side. I said, well, even if you grant the preservative side, that it's meant to preserve, that would seem to also legitimize you. That would entail that civil government has to undermine anything that would destroy the foundations of society. So if society requires certain things for it to function, people have to obey laws, people have to commit themselves to, restrain themselves. Also, there's a religious element as well. I think the foundation of society requires some kind of conception of religion or some religious element to maintain it. And so I said, well, that means that you can suppress atheism. Because atheism, to assert there is no God, is to undermine the foundation. I mean, at least the popular for morals, it's kind of the death of value, death of ethics and legitimacy of government. All sorts of things fall from there, I would say. But also the popular level, people would think that as well. And so it's worth to actually suppress atheism. That was my point in the tweet. Basically pushing back against people like Van Drunen, who says you can't act on the basis of religious opinions. But I'm just saying their own principles would lead them to that. And this is what the founders believe too, is that if you don't have religion, then you can't really have good morality. And this is what justified blasphemy laws, is it strikes at a fundamental good of society, which is the widespread belief in God, has a restraining, it restrains, it makes people truth tellers, it makes oath keeping, all sorts of things.
So. Yeah. I think that's an important point too, as well, one of the criticisms that you hear every now and then about Christian nationalism or establishmentarianism or whatever is that, we'd be out, drowning Baptists and, throwing Methodists in the fire and all that kind of stuff. But it's important to remember that even when these things were statutory illegal back in, whatever time you want to note, it wasn't because they were Methodists. It wasn't because they didn't baptize their babies. It was because they were disturbers of the peace.
Yeah.
That is the important detail that's often left out in that criticism, is that it's not a theological problem that the civil magistrate is dealing with. It is a civil problem bringing disorder into an ordered kingdom.
Yeah. That's a great point. And that's in my opinion, I think that's what Constantine was doing. I don't think Constantine was acting eschatologically or ecclesiastically. I think he's saying, I am the temporal ruler of this temporal realm, and your spiritual issues are jacking up my ability to do my job. And so you guys need to figure this out, because the issues in the church was disrupting. That's the thing. Like, we don't realize it. Like, the temporal affects the eschatological, and the eschatological temporal. Like, they're not like in these islands, right? So the temporal realm operating appropriately unto God, it intersects with and affects the eschatological realm. That's why God calls them nursing fathers, right? And also the church, when it's operating appropriately, like it has a negative or positive or negative effect. And so there's distinction, but there's also a corresponding effect of the two. And so nothing is, I don't know, this may sound strange, but I don't think nothing is purely and entirely temporal, and nothing is purely and entirely eschatological. You know what I'm saying? Like, the fact that like a church has people that are meeting in a building, right? And they have jobs and those jobs, those incomes, actually like are what is used to then fund the mission of the church. Like, there's some temporalness into the eschatological, even though it's eschatological, but there is some eschatological elements, right, to the temporal. For example, 1 Timothy 2 says, I want you to pray that people that have positions in the temporal realm, that they will be converted with supernatural grace as they operate in the temporal, right? So there's more, I don't know, there's more connection, I think, than people would admit, though there is a distinction. But one thing that came up many times is, as well as the historical failure objection. So this idea that Christianity in public is a biblical thing or a naturally plausible and reasonable thing, it's been proven to be an utter failure. So people make, when I talk about Scotland, they make fun of Scotland. When I talk about, the Westminster Assembly, when we talk about even things in the Roman Empire, like, how would you guys process that this has been proven time and time again to be a failure? And I think Scott Clark said, this is like, you guys are like communists. You think that it just hasn't been done well enough yet. And so you're going to figure out, Christendom in a way other people have. Like, how would you guys respond to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, it relies on like a faulty premise, or a premise that, if applied elsewhere, would be kind of would be pretty destructive. I mean, we have what 50% divorce rate now in marriage. Like, well, it looks like marriage has failed. I think it's higher than that now. I mean, we could go down the line. Most businesses fail, right? Don't most businesses? So why start a business? There's all sorts of like, if you're going to follow through with what I'm thinking is their major premise, it's
families,
all sorts of
families are,
all sorts of things. So I think, first of all, there's like faulty sense there. The other thing is, like, when we talk about success, like temporal success, over time things degrade, which is a fact of life in the world. But if you take, I don't know, I bet if you showed up to 1935 New England, I'm pretty sure you look around, most of those people got to heaven. So in that sense, it seems to me it's successful, at least in that snapshot of time. does it matter to them now in heaven that 100 years, 150 years later that's apostate or whatever it is? That doesn't really matter. So yeah, and so it was successful I would say in that sense, and it just historically eventually things went south and downhill. The other what was I going to say? Also, it assumes that there's some kind of default neutral that we are in now that is good, or it's good enough to just stay in this, as if there's a default, we're in it, and then we have to go back to a Christian nationalist perspective would then be to go outside of the default. And so I think that's faulty. I don't think we're in a default. I think the time of the neutral world, as Aaron Wren called it, I think that was because of Christendom, and it was not something. It was not a golden age, first of all, and nor wasn't it. I mean, it was highly historically conditioned as well, so it wasn't some neutral state, and we're out of that. We're not. So I don't. I think the argument overall just doesn't work for those reasons. We're not in a default position, and now we're trying to assert something outside of a norm or default. It's that you have alternatives. We're in an alternative. We're asserting a different alternative, and simply saying it doesn't work doesn't actually, or it hasn't worked, doesn't really deal with the issue or the argument.
Yeah, and the secular experiment is failing. All right, it's crumbling before us. It's producing chaos, and I think that's why a lot of younger people are open to older ideas. I think, the modern two kingdoms. It's not that there's no younger advocates of it, but a lot of them are kind of a certain age range, and I think it's on the decline. And I think as things get more chaotic under our current, American situation, I mean, people like to refer to it as the American experiment, but at least this modern, last 70 years experiment where the American courts they started secularizing everything. I mean, we don't need to go through all the history here, but it's working out very poorly. And as things get chaotic, I think that's just going to continue to show that it doesn't work. And so we need alternatives. So no one is claiming that past efforts at Christian nations were perfect or lasted forever. Obviously they didn't, but what are your alternatives?
Yeah. It's funny to me. Again, this goes back to the fact that nobody does the reading, but if you go back and you read, Gillespie, and you read Rutherford, read he's got in some of these conversations, there's an ignorance as to, what covenanting is and what social covenanting is and who held to that. A lot of people think that's purely an RPCNA thing, but everybody in Scotland was a covenanter. All Scottish Presbyterians are covenanters. And, the Seceder branch, which makes out the A in the ARP, they were heavy into that. They believed that the Solemn League and the National Covenant continued post 1690, and that it was the duty of church and state to renew those covenants at intervals. And Alexander Moncrief, who was one of the founders of the Seceder Presbytery, he wrote a book or a pamphlet that they called it back then on the duty of national covenanting. And in that, he makes explicit that if Scotland does not maintain her faithfulness to the covenant, then God's judgment will come down upon the nation of Scotland. Both church and state will fail and fall back into paganism and all numbers of wickednesses. And I'm not sure Alexander Moncrief would like to be called this, but I think he's fairly prophetic. The church and state failed in Scotland, and God's judgment is on Scotland. I think there's a reason why the wickedness of the German state in the 20th century was what it was. Right? That's God's judgment upon church and state for the 18th and 19th century abandonment of Christianity. Same thing can be said for Holland. You think about the source of a lot of the evils of euthanasia nowadays. Where was it really born out of? Well, out of Amsterdam, out of Holland, which used to be a bastion of Christianity. So there's an eschatological part of the conversation that they don't want to have in regards to the way that God judges nations for their failure to be obedient unto him. I mean, that's the story of the Old Testament. Is not just, of course, Israel, but all of the other nations that don't exist anymore because they failed to bow the knee to Jehovah. So I mean, it's an argument which ignores biblical testimony, but also just ignores reality that our God's still active in the world.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the things that's affecting that response is the republication view that oftentimes these R2K guys have. So republication says a lot of things, but one thing it says is that temporal judgments for disobedience and national behavior was simply a part of the parenthetical Mosaic period, where the Mosaic covenant was a mixed covenant that in some sense it was grace, but in some sense it was administration of the covenant works. And so that whole judging of a nation or peoples geographically for their behavior, that's not something that is common to all nations at all times. It was just something, it was like a tutorial, typological thing of the works covenant republished temporarily. But that's not reform. That's not Westminster position. That was a minority position. We believe that bad things happen to nations because of their behavior. As opposed, this is the thing about R2K people, that they're like functional deists. Like everything good and bad that happens nationally or locally, it has nothing to do with like people's religious beliefs. So you can pretty much be 1,000 Christians, in a city over here, a small city, and you could be 1,000, Muslims over here, and there would be no temporal differences, But the bad things that have happened in Christendom, like you say, it's related to judgment. And by the way, all the wickedness that we see in those societies was precipitated by apostasy and compromise in the church. So the church compromised on worship and doctrine, and then all of a sudden it affects other things. I think it's ridiculous to say that because a national identity with God has fallen, therefore it shouldn't exist, then pretty much rip the whole Old Testament out of your Bible and say every command that God gave to Israel in the magisterial sense is an utter failure because Israel rebelled against it, and it didn't, it had seasons where they were apostatized. So simply because people do things that undermines the integrity of something and God judges, it doesn't mean that it's not a good thing. Whether it's like, to Stephen's point, the family, our polity has failed so many times. Presbyterianism and connectional government has failed so many times. Like, so what? Why did it fail? Because it in itself was intrinsically faulty? No, because the people in it were bad and they messed it up, right? I don't know about you guys. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think you bring up a good point, which is that the modern two kingdoms view is heavily tied with, I mentioned it earlier, but Kleinian theology. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of this isn't the only thing, obviously, to bring up, but this is always in the background, is how do we read the covenants in the Old Testament. And so, the Kleinian modern two kingdom view, it has this, I think, faulty reading of the Noahic covenant and the Mosaic covenant a lot of times. And so they're saying, we're in the common grace covenant and the Noahic covenant, but they separate it from, the redemptive aspects. They actually say there's two Noahic covenants. And so that's why they can't read judgment. I mean, God promised not to flood the earth again, but he didn't promise to not bring other forms of judgment, right? Yeah. I know they say that's a suspension or whatever. But then the Mosaic covenant, we believe is gracious. We don't believe we're under the administration of the Mosaic covenant, as Israel was as a nation, right? So the judicial laws have expired, as the confession says. But we still believe that the Mosaic covenant was an expression of an application of the moral law to Israel and its particularity. So we can still read even those laws, and when the general equity of those laws, right, is rooted in nature and the moral law still apply, then they still, we can read them and say they still apply to us in some sense.
Yeah.
So all of that is like rejected, right? Or messed up by the modern two kingdoms view. So there's a lot of covenant theology issues here.
Yeah. If you have bad covenant theology, you're gonna have bad political theology, and it's all interconnected. But I think one thing you brought up in that point, and I've heard Stephen do this a bunch of times, is that the argument oftentimes is like, well, so the civil realm and public life is governed by natural law, and the church is governed by revelation. And it doesn't matter how you. It's funny because the Westminster Divines, they made arguments about Christendom and the punishment of public blasphemy from actual natural law. They made natural law arguments about the first table, and they made Christendom arguments about public religion also from the scriptures. So it was, I mean, the Ten Commandments in the scriptures and the Ten Commandments on the conscience, they're not entirely separate standards, right?
Well, because they equated the two, right? Moral law is equivalent to natural law. So, I mean, this modern Reformed Two Kingdoms view of natural law has to sit, which that's what they want to govern. Primarily or only the civil sphere. They have to say that doesn't include the first table. I don't know how you get there. I don't know how you make that division, but that's what. Yeah,
it's a complete like arbitrary distinction. That somehow you can divide the two tables up and then only apply one without. I mean, it's also weird when they say like, well, the civil magistrate cannot be cognizant of divine things, of the divine or God. How can you make sense of a second table, which is law given by a lawgiver, if you don't have some sense of the previous table, or just that there's a lawgiver? I mean, if you know God exists, then you can also know that God deserves worship, because I mean, the first commandment is not a commandment that's just like ad hoc, that it's a divine command disconnected from the nature of God and us as creatures in relation to a creator. It's actually, you should be able to know that as creatures of a mighty creator, you are to offer him obeisance, worship. So
that definitely
is they're all connected. You can't separate one from the other. And
it's the foundation. It's the foundation.
Every Reformed divine, when they start on Commandment 1, they say this is the foundation of everything that follows. So, God is one, worship God alone, and then, well, you ought to worship him rightly. You ought to honor the things, and then you ought to have a day set aside. So you have these, they're all connected. And then when they get to the second table, the fifth commandment, they then say, well, you can't understand the second table without the first. And so to separate them is utterly arbitrary. It violates the tradition. It violates logic. So.
Yeah, and even it's funny because this is novel. Modern Two Kingdoms, and I know, Benjamin, you could say something. Modern Two Kingdoms is not just novel theologically, but it's also novel culturally. What I mean by that is cultures never thought historically that religion and the sacred has nothing to do with public life. Like the ordering of sacred and the necessity of sacred. I mean, even like I forget who is it Aristotle or Plato or one of those guys, like that. Just basic humanity is religion matters for all of life. That's something common to all people. This is why where you go anywhere on the planet, not anywhere on the planet, because the West has been affected in a certain way, but actually no, it hasn't, because we still have our sacred days, right? And we still have our it's just shifted, but like the idea that like nature intuitively teaches the lack of necessity for the divine and something above us and beyond us to direct like social political life in some way, like that's not just modern in the church, it's modern period. What are you gonna say, Benjamin?
Well, you said something else that got my head first, but ask Kim Davis in Kentucky whether we have public blasphemy laws nowadays. But it goes back to something you said earlier about having a deistic view of God. Mm-hmm. Really, God is only the father of the church. He only has authority over the church, and that's not just a functional argument. That's the principle of the argument that's made against Reformed classical two kingdoms. And I don't know how you square that circle. I don't know how you can read the first chapter of the book of Genesis and then say the civil realm has nothing to do with God. It just doesn't make any logical sense.
Yeah. But then look at our current circumstances today. I mean, I think when you look at, okay, we have this secular society, civil government that has gotten rid of God in the first table. I mean, sixth commandment, seventh commandment, we have just absolute chaos there. I mean, we don't even use the death penalty anymore on the most heinous crimes, murder and whatnot. And then seventh commandment, which by the way, that should be the case with the Noahic covenant, right? Is the death penalty, and that I realize in affirming the death penalty, it's a minority position today. It's crazy. Seventh commandment, we have just absolute chaos. So I mean, all the LGBT stuff, and that's to act like that is just there and has nothing to do with kicking God out of the civil sphere, I think is crazy.
Absolutely. And the fact that God is somebody who doesn't historically, nationally, providentially bring destruction when people wave their fists at him, particularly nations that have a lot of light. It's not a people need to sing more psalms in the church to understand how God deals with such things.
And to kind of bring it back to the founding, maybe kind of close on this a little bit, but if you go read John Locke, who is the godfather of the United States in many ways, John Locke is all about the divine role in things and the nature of that stuff. I mean, he certainly wasn't a Scottish Covenanter in the full mess of that, but if you'd taken John Locke into Hillsdale and had him sit in a class, he would be dumbfounded to hear some of the arguments made on that front.
Yeah. Even this was Zach said this, that Thomas Jefferson was involved in legislating Sabbath breaking in Virginia. Apparently, he wanted people to not break the Sabbath.
The very same year they disestablished the church in Virginia, they passed Jefferson's Sabbath law.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Oh, here's a good closing thought. So, what do you, if you were to kind of land the plane, why do you believe there's such animosity pertaining to this? I tell you, I mean, I'm not Stephen Wolfe, and I'm certainly not Benjamin Glass, because Benjamin, man, you're like, no, I'm just kidding. I don't hear anybody complain about Benjamin. He's got that nice Southern accent, but I definitely have experienced people speak to me like I'm some barbaric subhuman person because of these views. Been accused of being heretical, Marxist, all sorts of stuff. What is this about? What is the vitriol and animosity pertaining to us wanting to be more classic, more historical? What is it about? I mean, obviously we can't discern the motives of every person, but we could, we can deduce and somewhat speculate somewhat with a bit of wisdom. What do you guys think? What is this about, man?
We're now the disturbers of the peace.
I see. So it's disrupting the regime norm, and so it's about that. I
think So the evangelical elite, their primary job in the social order is to manage evangelical decline and also encourage it, but generally manage it. And so that's the posture that they take. So when someone comes along like us and we want to have a more assertive politics, and also addresses certain social issues, and political issues, ecclesiastical issues, that gets them all very nervous, and they have to then bring out their war machine. I mean, that's what I think. Kevin DeYoung's a nice guy, but I think his review was basically not about refuting any of my positions, but simply saying this is dangerous stuff and we can't platform or give it a solid hearing, and this is it. And so that's the mentality of we just need to kind of squash it. And because we're in a time of transition, we have a lot of young people you've seen a lot of weakness, a lot of decline, and then people, and essentially the evangelical either resigning to it or capitulating, basically becoming one of them, and then turning their sights back on us. And people are trying to figure out a reason. Like they want a theological and philosophical and just a good justification for why they can be active politically in our world, and in a way that says not just neutrality, I mean, but also more, hey, we should have a Christian order and go back to something that was better. So I think there's a lot of reasons. If the book came out like 10 years ago, my book came out 10, 20 years ago, I don't think people would have been as excited. But now I think it's also the fact that I'm essentially a conservative Presbyterian. And also I'm not exactly an evangelical, I guess, but I guess I am in the eyes of the elite. I am. Mm-hmm. And so then I assert this book using the Christian nationalist label, and it freaks everyone out. And there's stuff in there that they want to construe as being Nazi and all that stuff. So it kind of freaks everyone out. And also it's caught on. There's a lot of people are kind of excited, even people who are not fully on my strange array of positions. If they're post milk, Hyperion, whatever, they're still saying, hey, there's energy behind this. We all generally agree, and they like the idea of a nation of people of familiarity, and so they just
go
for it. I definitely think there's been a lot of guys have lived in a Reformed silo for 30, 40 years, and the silo door got opened and all the grain's escaping, and they don't know what to do, so they just scream into the void.
There's other elements too. There's the retrieval movement, which I relied upon significantly, where I'm essentially saying, let's go back. I mean, there's some things that are different with me, kind of different terminology, but I tried to pull from the retrieval perspective. And that is another threat, because they thought, oh, hey, we can retrieve Turretin and these Junius and these others, but it turns out that they want to execute heretics too. So, and then Wolf just cites them and says, well, these guys thought it too. And that freaks them out too. It's like, I've gone rogue in my scholarship. There's all sorts of things.
They are right that this stuff's dangerous in a sense, or the case for Christian nationalism is dangerous in the sense that it's going back to earlier Reformed theology and Reformed arguments, and they're going to have trouble refuting this stuff. I think they already are, and they're worried of what's coming. I mean, because there's other stuff too. I mean, I've been attacking kind of complementarianism, especially the narrow variety. So all of this retrieval stuff has got them, I think, worried about. I don't know. We might just actually hold older Reformed views. I mean, how awful?
Yeah.
But
I have a few things that we could talk about this for a while. But I think one thing I've noticed is that I feel like a lot of Christians, they lack a spiritual vitality, and they're doing a lot of immoral things in regular everyday life. Whether it's with their children or themselves, like in the way they conduct themselves. And so I think the thought that Christianity would be actually a measure and standard beyond your private piety, I think it scares, like, what would happen to me in my life and my children, because a lot of people, they conduct their lives publicly, and they vote and they work in a certain way and they act in a certain way that is immoral. So imagine, like, if a marriage actually treated adultery as a crime in the name of the Lord, like, what would happen to my kids who are, shacked up and whatnot. So I think there's a morality component. I think what I've noticed, a lot of the men, this is not everybody, but a lot of the people I've noticed that are very attracted to the real everyday world being totally nuked under secularism is there's a deep brokenness and failure morally in their lives. And I think some stuff in your book picked up on that with just holistic vitality and help. So there's that. I think there's a fear of righteousness actually impacting and restraining and challenging regular life. I think there's also I think there's an effeminate Christology that I think affects this conversation. So there's a view of Jesus as a suffering victim. There's a diminishing and dilution of him as ascended and triumphant in grand conquest, seen as presented in our tradition and our standards. And so I don't know, I feel like this view of Christ and this view of God, when you see how the songs that people sing in church and the way he's presented, he's a soteriological savior that saves you, justifies you, and gives you an afterlife. But he's not the sovereign Lord who threatens nations and kings and demands allegiance and homage and wants to smash the heads of all the empires that oppose him. Like, there's a view of Jesus that I think is very idolatrous, very reductionist, and domesticated. And whenever men talk about Jesus' lordship in some way that confronts things comprehensively, in some way that intimidates unrighteousness, I think that it exasperates and provokes this phony Jesus that people have been duped by. And so I'm telling you something, when you talk about Jesus as ruler of nations and kings, when you talk about Jesus as the one who the nations are to seek his law, like, that is something that was written by God to appeal to those who God has entrusted to oversee his reality in society, namely men. And I feel like a reductionistic view of Jesus has affected men's ability to see like his rights and his claims on all things. And I don't know, you think about like the women are made a certain way because they are blessed to be in a certain way, right? And so they have certain tendencies and attributes and certain things they're more inclined to. But when that gets infused into Jesus' character and in our worship and in our piety and spirituality, at the end of the day, like, all this stuff is just not nice. That's what I got from all these things, bro. Like with whether it's Clark or DG Hard or other guys, like, it's like, what about the feelings of the Mormons and the Muslims, and what about the Hindu who hears your prayer about the Lordship of Christ, and it's just like this. It's not nice, and like, women are, women will not talk to men the way men do. Like, they're not going to look at their friend and say, you're fat, because it's not nice. You know what I'm saying? Like, the guys are more candid and honest, and so there's an effeminacy, I think, in the evangelical world and the reform world. And I think it's about doxology, it's about Christology, it's about doctrine of God, and it bleeds into this conversation. And that's just my take on some of it. It's just
and that's the retrieval stuff is such a huge part of it. I mean, 15 years ago, I would have never read Alexander Moncrief's The Duty of National Covenant. It just wouldn't have been available to me or to any other human being who doesn't live in Scotland. The reprinting of Van Maastricht has been a huge thing, because the entire first volume of Van Maastricht on Prolegomena, Doctrine of God, talks at length about the responsibilities of the civil magistrate, and all in the doctrine of God, not in ethics, not in some kind of offhand way, but just as the natural order of who God is. And it's hard to fight against that.
Yeah.
And like I said, that's what frustrates them.
Yeah. I think one thing that you guys brought up a little bit is people are listening. I think that's what's also making people very angry. And we're not. I don't know. I mean, I can't be totally. I think sometimes I have to admit, like, I do think I can not be fully godly when I'm saying things, and maybe I get wrapped up in the moment. But I think when you articulate like historic reform biblical theology, it makes people look bad that are just on some other wavelength. And so people are listening. And I think these arguments are making people look silly. And I think a lot of this is just personal, like kind of like embarrassment and kind of like credibility, right? And so like my my entire ministry is being questioned by what you're saying, and people are actually listening to it. And so I'm just like swinging at, I'm hitting it with a bat. You know what? You know why people don't like Stephen says, like a lot of times people don't make arguments. You don't actually make arguments because you don't have arguments, and you're just offended and bothered, and it's a personal thing. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's an element to it as well. This conversation is striking at something that is weak in Christianity in the West. We're on to something, and I think that's why we need to like press on and push forward, because I think we're striking at something that is exactly getting at the heart of what's the issue and what's wrong, you know. And it's being addressed in different fronts, different ways, different emphases. But I think we're on to something. You know what I'm saying? And that's one of the things, like, I'm not a Doug Wilson fan. Probably everybody knows here, that here. I tell Zach all the time. But I tell like the Napart guys, there's a reason why people are wanting to hear what these guys are talking about. It's not just because, oh, glory theology and you know, we're you know, carnal, overly eschatology. It's because there's a vacuum that Christians have not been experiencing, and now people are speaking into it, you know, and people are listening. So anyways, any closing thoughts? Anything else? I'm done. Anything else, Ben? Give us like a one-liner like thought, man. Like boom.
I think we covered everything today. I think we're done.
Yeah.
All right.
Read the seceders. That's all. That's my one line.
What do you say?
Do the reading. That's what Stephen likes.
Do the reading. It's there. Not hard.
I should say that that's
the work.
originally that's a Time and Klein quote. I just picked up on it and ran.
It's a good one.
That's Time and Klein. He's stolen other things from me, and he hasn't admitted it. He has lines that he's taken from me. So
Yeah.
but I'll admit that I took that from Time.
Yeah. Read your Bible. Read your you know, ecclesiastical statements.
Be the Christian prince you want to see in the world.
There you go.
Don't make up new theology. How about that?
Hey, just, you know what, real quick. Hey, Stephen, do you believe that America needs a Christian prince who is going to preside over the church, you know, as like this kind of like, you know, messianic Gestapo? Is that what you're saying? I just is that what you're saying? Go ahead and speak to that, man, real quick.
Okay, real quick. I'll try. When I say Christian prince, because again, it's like the generic civil ruler. I didn't want to say civil ruler or magistrate. I wanted to have something that captured the imagination of people, a sort of figure that would inspire greatness. So not just a guy who's a policy wonk, but someone with personality, gravitas. And I thought prince was a proper word for that, because again, it wasn't like 9 out of 10 chapters is about general political theory, not America. The cover kind of just can easily distort what the book is about, or you'll misunderstand through it. But I think that it's permissible that you could have a Christian magistrate who's heavily involved in, according to how I stated. You have to look at how I stated. But in our American tradition, it would be inappropriate. So I think things can be permissible, but not appropriate or prudent. And so I'm not an absolutist in that sense. I'm a paleoconservative who likes traditions and customs and ways of life and political traditions. And so in an American way of life, we wouldn't want some like a head of the church. Anyway, I want to go too far into that, but that's the idea. We wouldn't want that. And so I'm okay with the American perspective. Yeah. If I were British, I might, I guess, maybe have a different perspective on that. And that's fine. I mean, I would disagree with Episcopalians, but I'm not going to make a big fuss about it. And but yeah, that's the idea. The main idea of the prince is that he's an ideal sort of figure who embodies a type of personality, virtue, piety, gravitas that can capture the imagination of the people to seek after their own good. That's the idea. It's a great man sort of perspective on leadership that Americans, I think, occasionally have. I think George Washington was a great man in that regard, who inspired greatness in a very American way. And so I would love to see a new type of modern George Washington, I guess. I really wouldn't want to fight in a revolution, but or general, not necessarily general, but that sort of person would embody the Christian Prince ideal.
Yeah, and you just touched on something I think key is that that a lot of these guys, I think that may bother them because they've convinced themselves that they are the only Christian people of significance in the world. Like the pastor is the only spiritual person with a spiritual vocation. And so we're going to talk about the necessity or importance of any other Christian anywhere else. I think they get a little jealous and they start, ecclesiasticizing Christianity and Christian vocation. So anyways, great conversation, guys. Your contributions, particularly, are very helpful. And hopefully, you guys listening, we'll see that this conversation has many types coming from different angles. And I think it can be helpful. And we don't all have to talk, me and Benjamin are talking more, like the covenanter side. Stephen has, his philosophical and historical way of speaking about things, and Zach is just everything. He's a little bit of everything, and so everyone does not have to be speaking about things, monopolized way. So it was good. I appreciate your time. It's been almost 2 hours, but hey, man, like if I get you guys on here, I'm gonna all at once. We've got to get it all out. So, anyways, Kingdom Polemics signing off. Grace and peace.